All right, welcome everybody for one more session on AWS. In this particular session, we are basically going to look about Lambda functions, use cases of Lambda. We're going to understand about API gateway, and we're going to do some hands-on exercises on Lambda as well as on API gateway. All right, that would be the agenda for this particular session. Now, let's try and understand first what are Lambda functions. Or else let's say, what is a Lambda function and why it is very important. Now, we can say a Lambda function is basically a compute service that will help you to run your code without provisioning or without managing any servers. Now, what does that mean? So we know there are a lot of services on AWS, compute services, especially we know there is something like EC2 instance, right? We know there's something like EC2 instance, okay, and there is something like containers, beanstack, right? These are the different compute services that we have on AWS. But for every service, we need to underline, mention the compute infrastructure, like how many CPUs you require, what is the storage you require, or else what is the memory do you require for this particular services, even for containers, beanstack, or for EC2. Now, AWS is coming up with this service called as Lambda. Now, this is basically called as a serverless service. Now, what is this serverless service exactly means? Does it mean that we don't require any servers at all? If we don't require any servers, then how are we going to do the compute of the code? We require some compute, right? Then how we can call it as serverless? Now let us say I have a code Python code file. Let's say the file name is some app.py. Okay, I have a Python code file. Now I want to run this file. So if we have to run this file, we know that we require a compute. But now with the help of Lambda service, with the help of Lambda, right? Now what AWS is saying that you can create a Lambda, okay, and give the code to Lambda service whenever you want to run this. So basically we can configure a trigger. Whenever we configure a trigger, what AWS will do? AWS will basically assign a compute, okay? It will assign a compute, and then your app, this compute will run your code file, okay? Now it will give the output. Once you get the output, okay, this compute would be removed. So that is the meaning of serverless. That means whenever your code requires compute to run the program, AWS provides the compute under the hoods. Once the program runs and you get the output, AWS will automatically terminate the compute. And you will be charged, for example, let's say this app.py file, if it is taking around 3 seconds to run, okay, you will be charged only for the 3 seconds. Now if you don't have any service like this, now if we purchase an EC2 instance for 24 hours, even if you're using it for 1 second, you will be charged for 24 hours. But in case of Lambda, You will only be charged for the amount of time that your compute is running, or amount of time that your code is taking to run. All right. So that service is called as serverless service, and on AWS you can call it as AWS Lambda. Okay, when we do a couple of more demos, we'll understand in depth about that. So that is the basic use of AWS Lambda service to run the programs without provisioning any compute. Whenever your code requires compute, it will assign, it will run, give the output, and the compute is removed. All right. Now let us understand some use cases when you can use Lambda. Okay, you can use a Lambda function for file processing, or for streaming data processing, or for some web applications, or if you have some IoT applications to run IoT backend, you can use Lambda, or for mobile backend. So these are the some of the use cases that you would come across when you're using Lambda. You can also use Lambda extensively in data processing, or collecting data from uh, multiple sources. All right. So these are the some of the use cases for Lambda. Now let us discuss about one more service called as API Gateway, and then we will do hands-on exercises on both Lambda as well as API Gateway. Okay. Now what is an API Gateway? Now there are a lot of API gateways which are open source, some are charged. Now AWS provides a gateway API with the service called as API Gateway. Now first let us understand what why do we need a gateway and what is an API gateway. Then it will be very easy for us to uh, understand when we are doing a hands-on exercise. Okay, now every application has multiple parts. There is backend, there is front end. Now let's say I have a backend database. Okay, let's say database which is hosted on AWS. Let's call it as internal. All right. Now we have a web service or some other service, some other service. These are external. Okay, external, that means they are not on AWS. I mean, in case if it is not AWS, let's understand some other, let's say on premises data center also. Okay, we have database internal, and we have some other services external. Now let's say if any of this service, if it has to communicate with the database, we have to allow this traffic inside our internal network, right? So that is a service which will help us to communicate between external or internal, or you can say establishes communication between two applications with the help of a service called as API gateway. Okay, with the help of service called as API gateway. Okay, that is what an API gateway is in short. Now, an Amazon API gateway, we know that it's an AWS service. With the help of this, we can create, publish, maintain, and monitor the uh, REST APIs, HTTP APIs, and WebSocket APIs at any scale. So basically, AWS, with the help of AWS API, it gives us a lot of options here. If we want, we can configure a HTTP API, or else we can configure a REST API. Okay, or we can configure a WebSocket API, or we can work with internal services with AWS. Now, what is a HTTP API or a REST API? In short, a HTTP API works with basically websites which allows traffic with hypertext protocol, HTTP protocol. Now, a REST API majorly works with when there are a lot of networks that are involved. Okay, that is what a HTTP API and a REST API. Now, let's understand this use case. Now, let's say there's a client who wants to invoke a Lambda function. Okay, that means what? We created one Lambda function. Now, there's a client who wants to invoke a Lambda function, but the client, let's say it is a HTTP client. Now, how he can invoke this Lambda function? He can simply invoke the Lambda function with the help of a API. So when the client who is outside sends tries to invoke the Lambda function, he will tell the API that you have to start the Lambda function, and the Lambda function will execute and it will give the output to the client. So this happens through API. This is one of the use cases. We'll also see other use cases. So first of all, what will we do? We will try and create some hands-on exercises. Then it will be easy for you guys to understand Lambda and API. Okay, let me shift to my AWS console for that. Even before that, let me make a note of all the hands-on exercises that we are going to do for this particular session. Okay, the first hands-on exercise, we are going to create a simple Lambda function with Python code. Second one, Lambda function with Node.js code. Okay. And then we are going to create an API gateway. Okay, now we will create another Lambda function. Okay, in this is again Python code. In this Lambda function, what we'll do, we'll write a code that it will automatically create an EC2 instance. Okay. All right. And then we will create an API gateway. We create an AWS API gateway, and we will connect, or let's say we'll trigger Lambda from API gateway. All right. So these are the hands-on exercise that we're going to do. So now let me quickly move to my AWS console for that and implement this Lambda function for Python code. Let me go here, AWS console, aws.amazon.com, go to option called as sign in console. All right, now search for a service called as Lambda. Now you see there's a service called as Lambda here. Let me click on that. Now there's an option here called as create a function. Now if we see what all languages that we can work with Lambda, you see it has integration with .NET, with language called as Go. You can give a code in Java, Node.js code, Python, Ruby. So this all are there already. I mean, your Lambda is compatible with these languages. But if you have any custom runtime, that let's say your own code, etc., you can also bring your custom runtime. Okay, that is how Lambda works. I mean, these are the supported languages for Lambda. Now select this option called as create a function. Now this is the page where you create a function. Now first of all, let us also understand what is the meaning of function. Function means it is nothing but a piece of code that we are giving to Lambda, saying that whenever a user asks you to run a code, this is the code that you have to run. Okay, let's say a client triggers a Lambda function or triggers a Lambda. Now what is the code Lambda has to run? That one we define in a function. Now there are three options for us to define. One is from author from scratch. Second is use a blueprint. Third is container image. That means we have Docker containers, Docker files, right? I mean, we have a service on AWS called as ECR, Elastic Container Registry. So using a Docker container as well, we can run a Lambda function. Okay, let us see a couple of ways. First, we'll do author from scratch, and then we will create a Lambda function using a container image. All right. Now let me go here, give a name to the function. I will give the function name as demo. All right. And you see the runtimes here, all the supported runtimes, .NET, Go, Java, Node.js, Python, Ruby, other supported different versions. Now for this hands-on exercise, let us choose Python 3.0. Okay. Now before creating a function, it is saying that do you want to create a IAM role which has a basic Lambda permissions, or else we can choose one of the existing roles or we can create a new one. I already have one existing. I will use that in the next hands-on exercise. But for this, I am going to choose a basic Lambda permissions. I am asking it to create a role. All right. Select this option called as create function. Now the function is getting created. This may take about a minute. All right. The function is created now. It is saying that successfully created the function, and what is the name of the function? Demo. Now if you see here, the function has demo. This is the name of the function, and there are two things for this. One is add trigger, one is add destination. Now basically what is add trigger? When you want us to run this code. Okay, now if I go into add trigger, there are a lot of options. Okay, now you can trigger the Lambda from Alexa, you can trigger Lambda from Apache Kafka, Gateway, from a load balancer, code commit, from DocumentDB, DynamoDB, Kinesis, from S3. So we will, in one of our hands-on exercise, we'll configure S3 as a trigger. Okay, SNS topic could be a trigger for Lambda function. Whenever you receive some notification, automatically a Lambda function will trigger. Okay, and there are also other open source tools that AWS has partnered with to run Lambda function. All right, you can go through this list when you do hands-on exercise. But for this, I'm not configuring trigger because it's a first hands-on exercise. In the next exercise, I'll configure trigger. Now let's scroll down. Here you see there is something called as lambda function.py file. Okay, in this particular file, you see there's the code. Okay, so you see the definition. That means we are creating a function. The function name is lambda handler, and it has two things. One is event, one is context. Okay, so there's already a Python code here. I will just change this to level up. All right, now I just changed it, so we have to deploy these changes. Select the option deploy. Okay, I have deployed the changes. It is saying that successfully updated a function demo. Okay, and then you see I want to see whether this particular function can run or not, so that I can do a small test here. It is asking create a new event. I'll give the event name as demo event, or else I'll put it as event 1. This event, whether you want to share it with anybody or it is private. Let's say it is private as of now, and I will invoke this. Now you see this test event is successful. Okay, and it is showing us the result. Status code 200 means successful, and it is saying that hello from level up. This is the response that we got when I ran this test event, because this is the code that we have given. Okay, now you see it is showing us the report, how much time it has taken. It has taken 1.17 millisecond, and the billing duration is for 2 milliseconds. The memory size that it has used is 128 KB to run this, and memory used 36 KB. All the stats are there here. Okay, now we have ran our Lambda code very successfully. It has showed us the output. Okay, this is a simple hands-on exercise. Now let us use another. Let us create another function with a Node.js code, and we'll put a little complicated code. I mean, not complicated, little advanced code, so that we can see the output in a better manner. Let's go ahead and select this create function. I will author this from the scratch, and I will name this function as demo1. Okay, permissions. Again, I want this to create a basic Lambda permissions. Now you see previous function, we have created the runtime as Python. Now we are creating the runtime as Node.js. So that means when you have to create a function, you should know that you're using this function, or you should know what is the input that you're going to give. Which language your code is there, developed in which language. You should know that. All right, select this option called as create function. Now a second function is creating. The name of the function is demo1. Right, let the function get created. Now you see the function is created, demo1. All right, now if I go here, you see there's a little change in the code, because this is a node.mjs file. You see export constant handler, async is given. Okay, constant response, etc. Now I have a little Node.js code. Let me take the code. Okay, this is a Node.js code. Let me copy it, or let me paste it here. Okay, there is no comma. That's the reason it is showing error. Let me put the commas there. Okay, I missed the comma there. Let me put it back. All right, now, so what this function has to do, basically, I have given a list of multiple strings. Okay, now I'm declaring a message, and what this message has to do, it has to take these messages, and randomly it has to show one string out of these messages. That is the basic function of this code. Now let us deploy this. Okay, successfully updated the function demo1. Now let's do a test. Okay, now we have to create an event to run this. Let's say I'm giving it as event1, and then you can remove the format, it's not required. Select option invoke. Now you see in the response, it has taken only one string out of it. It is saying that learn DevOps, AWS and cloud at level up. Let's say I want to test it again. You see it is saying level up, DevOps, AWS, cloud skills. Now let me test again. It is randomly taking the multiple string out of that particular list that we have given. Okay. Now let's do what? Let's connect this demo1 function, basically a Lambda function, to an API gateway, and let's try to invoke this Lambda function with the help of API gateway. Okay, so let's go to API gateway. I'm opening this in a different console here. Sign into console, select option API gateway. Okay, so this is the API gateway. Now you see there's an option called as build. So there are different types of APIs we can build. One is called as HTTP API. Second one is called as a WebSocket API. Third one is called as REST API. Fourth one is called as again a REST API, but it is only private. Okay, there are two types of REST APIs we can build. One is private, one is public. So now in this REST API, we will have full control of all the responses that we can, all the management capabilities we'll have. Now, what is a WebSocket API? So this is built for the persistent connections for real-time use cases like chat applications. Okay, if you're using a chat applications and if you want an API for that, then you have to use a WebSocket API. And for a web applications, we can use a HTTP API. For our use case, let us create a REST API. Select this option called as build. Click OK. Now it is saying that for simple, they have given an example API. That means they have already given some API, some code in the API which has get all the requests, get request, post request, etc. We can use this. Okay, let's do one thing. First, let us create this API as a sample example, and then we'll create our new API. Okay, we can select this option called as import. Now the API is created. Now you see there's an option called as actions here. So now if you see the resources, there is get request, there is post request. Now if I go to actions, we can also create a method. Okay, what all methods we can create? So inside get, we can have any method, delete and head, options, patch, post, put. These are the different methods that we have. Now if I go here and create a method, create method. Okay, this is not saved. Go to actions, create method. Okay, we're getting that. That's okay. We'll see that again in the next hands-on exercise. So these are the different actions. Now, if we want this API to work, go to actions, select this option called as a deploy API. What is the deployment stage? It's a new stage. Okay, let me give this as a demo stage 1. All right, and then deploy. So basically what we are doing now, we have deployed this particular API. Now, once you deploy this API, you will get a URL which we can invoke. Okay, there are a lot of options. We will see that. First of all, let me go ahead and copy this particular URL, put this in a browser and enter. Now you see, basically this URL is communicating with the application called as pet store API. Okay, there is get request that we have done. There is postman request. Okay, that is how the API is working. But now we want to invoke a Lambda function from this API. So let us do that. Select this option called as create API. Let's create a REST API, build, and then I want to choose as a new API, not the example API. It's a new API. So if there's an option called as clone from an existing API. So if you already have an API that you have created from scratch, there is no need for you to create that from scratch again. You can directly clone it. You see that API is visible here. Let's say this option create a new API. Here I'll give my API name as execute Lambda. Okay, this is a regional endpoint. Select option, create API. So now if you see here in this API, there are no methods. We have to create our own method. Let's go to actions here. You see there's an option called as create method. And now here, there are all the options. delete, get, head, options, patch, post. Now I want to get the information what Lambda has executed, right? I will take it as a get method. Okay. Now you see this get method I have to set up. How I can set up? I can either use a Lambda function or a HTTP or a mock, AWS or VPC. Okay. But I want to execute this Lambda function. Okay. Where we have created our Lambda function, which region? These are regional resources. Go to Lambda. I have created in a Mumbai region. What is the name of my Lambda? It is demo1. Let me go here, type the name of my Lambda function demo1. Okay. Now save. See, I have created a get request and then save it. It's saying that you're about to give API gateway permissions to invoke your Lambda function. I'm okay with that. I want to give permissions. Let's say okay. Right now, if we see, there is something like a test here. So now if I do test, what happens? From this API, the request will go to Lambda. It will take the Lambda function called as demo1. It will run this Lambda and I will get the response to the API. Okay, let us do a test. You see, there's an option called as test. Let's test it. You see here what we got: learning, DevOps, AWS, and cloud at level up. So that is what our Lambda function, right? Now let me test again. You see, it is taking multiple from that list. It is taking the strings randomly and it is showing. Test one more time. You see this happens. Test one more time. Right? That is how basically we can create a API gateway and invoke a Lambda function from a API gateway. All right. Now the test is working. Let's go to this APIs. This is the API. Open this API. And let's go to actions here. We didn't deploy that. We just tested it. Let's do a deployment. Deployment stage. New stage. I'll mention it as demo stage 2 and then deploy this. Now you see there's a URL for this particular API gateway. Now let me copy this and put this URL inside a browser. And you see now the output of Lambda function we can see here. Now whenever I refresh, I am seeing a different string. That means this API is invoking the Lambda function and output of Lambda function we can see it here. Right? Now if I go to the Lambda here, that Lambda function demo1, okay, and then if you go into monitor, okay, we can see, you see there are a lot of spikes because we are using that Lambda function there. Okay, we can also go to logs, see how many times we have invoked this function. Okay, that is how we can create an API gateway, execute a Lambda function or call a Lambda function from an API gateway. Now let us do create one more Lambda function. Now there are multiple options here, right? One is from author from scratch, second is from blueprint, third one is from a container image. Let's say I already have a container image. I want to create a Lambda function from this particular container image. Now let's say I will give my function name as demo3. Now I already have a ECR registry and already have an image there. So select browse images, select the repository. Okay, now I don't have a repository in this Mumbai region. I have a repository in a North Virginia region. Okay, let me go there. So these are regional resources. Okay, now let me give my name of the function as demo3. Let's say browse images. You see, I have a repository here. Select this repository, and I have a image by name level up. Okay, let me select this image, and then let me go ahead and let me choose an existing role. So I already created a couple of roles. Okay, I given a role called as my lambda role, which I have given an admin access for this particular role, and select option called as create function. Okay, now I'll show you what is there. So now basically what, a container image which I have put on ECR, I'm taking that image and created a function. So whenever my function runs, whatever is the code in that particular container image, that should run. Okay, now let's do a test. Go to option test here. It is saving test event. I'll give it as demo 4 and then test. You see, execution function succeeded. Now if you say the output of that particular container program is this one, hello anonymous, this is a lambda containerized app. That is the output. But now if I want to see that on the web, what we can do, there's an option called as configuration. For every lambda function, we can create a function URL. Okay, where I can create this function URL? In the configuration, there is this function URL. Select option create function URL. Okay, now is it asking, can anybody access this URL or only AWS IAM users? I'm giving this as anybody can access this particular URL. Select option save. All right, now you see there is a function URL. Let me copy this URL and put that on the browser and let's enter this. Now you see, hello anonymous, this is a lambda containerized app. So that is what the function of that particular container to run this code. Okay, now if I give any Python code to this container, it will run that particular Python app. Whenever the lambda function triggers, it will run that code which is there in that container. Okay, now let us do one more hands-on exercise and we will configure a trigger for this hands-on exercise. Okay, let's go to functions, select option create function. Now I'll say this author from the scratch. I'll give it the name as lambda ec2. So now this particular lambda function that I'm going to create, the function of this lambda function is that whenever this lambda function is created or this lambda function is executed, it has to create an EC2 instance from it. Okay, it has to automatically create an EC2 instance whenever this function is called for. Okay, select option create function. Now you see a lambda function is created. Now this function we created for a Python code. Now you see I have the code already. So this is the code to create a EC2 instance, basically defining a function which is called as lambda handler. We are defining event and context. We are downloading a Boto3 client, etc. Okay, we can go through this code and understand. Okay, now let me copy the code and put the code here. All right, now deploy the code. Now the code is deployed. Now I don't want to test this code. I want to run this code directly without testing. I don't want to run it manually. I want to run this with the help of a trigger. Now, before that, let's go to EC2 instances and see if we have any EC2 instances. Go to EC2 instances here. Okay, now if I go to EC2 instances, there are 0 instances. Okay, there are no instances here. Now let me go to this Lambda. I'm adding a trigger. So from where we can add the trigger, I showed you a lot of options, right? Anyone could trigger a Lambda function. Now let's say I want to put it as S3. Now which bucket in S3? So I already have a bucket. I'm choosing this bucket. So what this bucket, whatever happens to this bucket, either put, post, copy, or multi-part upload, or any event delete, anything deleted, any restore happened, any object in. So basically, you can choose whatever events on which event you have to trigger the Lambda function. I have chosen all the options there so that whatever happens on the S3 bucket, a EC2 instance should be created. Now let's say select option add. Okay, I already have a configuration for this bucket. So it is saying that configuration for the same bucket cannot happen. So let me create a new bucket. Go to S3 here, select option S3. Okay, select option create bucket. I'll give the bucket name as demo for Lambda trigger. Okay, and then rest all I will leave it as defaults. Select option create bucket. A bucket is created. Let me go here, refresh this, choose the bucket that I have created now. Okay, all the objects will remain same. Let me add this now. Okay, now a trigger is also added. Okay, now when I add a object now, this function will fail. This will not execute successfully. I'll tell you why it is failed and how to rectify that. Let me go to S3 bucket. Now let me add a file to this S3 bucket. Go to option upload and add files. Okay, select some file, select option open and upload. Okay, the file is uploaded. Let us go to EC2 instance. Let's see if any EC2 instance is created here. You see there is no EC2 instance created. Okay, let's go to this Lambda function. Let's go to monitor. Let's go to logs here. Okay, this is coming up. You see nothing has come. There is no recent invocations. Why this has failed? Okay, let me show you failed, how it will appear. Let's go to test. Okay, I'll say demo for event and test it. You see after 3 seconds this has failed. Now it is giving an error message saying that task time load after 3 seconds. So now what happens is that this Lambda function, it is having the capability only to run the code for 3 seconds. If the code doesn't run in 3 seconds, it will fail. Now can I increase the time here? Yes, I can increase the time. For that, let's go to configuration here. Go to general configuration. You see there is timeout here. Only 3 seconds. That is the reason it is getting timed out. Select option edit and go here. Let's say I'm giving timeout as 10 minutes. That means you can run the code till 10 minutes. Same thing applies for memory and storage. You cannot run a code which is more than 512 MB. If you want to increase, you can increase that. And if your code is going to occupy more memory space, it will not run if it is more than 128. Maximum you can go is this in memory, that is around 1 TB. In storage, around 1 TB. All right. Now I have made the edits. Let me save it. Now let me go to S3 and then upload a file. Let's go to S3. Let's go to this and then upload a file. Add files. Add some random file. Select option open. Upload. Okay, you see this is uploaded successfully. Let's go to EC2 now. Now you see instances are automatically, because I have ran this couple of times, right? So if you see, instances are created, okay, automatically as soon as we uploaded some object. That is how you can use a Lambda function as well. So we can use a Lambda function so that we can automatically create an instance. So this is one use case when you want to create instances automatically, do some function for you and get deleted. All right, let's recap what we have learned. We basically understood what is Lambda. We understood what is an API gateway. We did this couple of hands-on exercise of creating a basic Lambda function with Python code, Lambda function with Node.js code, created a Lambda function to create EC2 instances automatically by using Python. We created an API gateway and we invoked a Lambda function from API gateway. Okay, this is what we have learned in this particular session. So basically Lambda function, we can call it as a serverless compute uh, service on AWS. All right. See you guys in the next lecture. Take care.